Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's national call. We have a very large call planned. We have about close to 1,300 people registered. I can see we have almost 400 people on already. I'm going to give it at least a couple minutes to give more people a chance to join before we start with the agenda. Thanks for your patience. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We have a large call today with over 1,000 people registered. So I'm going to give it another minute to allow for more people to join before we get started. Thanks for your patience. We'll get started in just a moment. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining our weekly HoUSed call for universal, stable, affordable housing. We have a very large call today with nearly 1,300 people registered. So more people will be joining as I speak, but I appreciate you all joining, especially during what is going to be another really extraordinarily busy and consequential week ahead. And before we talk about everything that is needed, all that we need you to be doing in the coming days and weeks, I just want to say at the outset that I know that so many of you, so many of us are tired. You have worked so hard throughout the pandemic to keep the lowest income and the most marginalized people safe and healthy and stably housed during the pandemic. You've often done this at the expense of your own health while understaffed and overwhelmed with competing urgent needs and limited resources to meet them. And you have been urging policymakers to act for over 19 months. And each time, each ask from us is more urgent, more historic than the last. And I'm just so grateful to all of you for the work that you continue to do day in and day out. And I know that you're tired, but we can't stop now. This really is the moment that we have been waiting decades for. These next couple of weeks are going to be hugely consequential in our collective efforts to end homelessness and housing poverty in our country. These weeks will determine whether Democrats are able to use their majority to make historic and long overdue investments in getting and keeping the lowest income people affordably housed. And many have said it before, but to say it again, this really is at a minimum a once in a generation opportunity. It may well be a once in a lifetime opportunity. In my 20 plus years of doing this work on homelessness and affordable housing, there's never been a moment like this where so many factors are aligned to create the opportunity we have before us. It's truly a once in a lifetime moment. We have a movement for housing justice that is stronger and broader than ever. We have a president who, unlike any president before him, frames housing as a human right and has called for universal housing vouchers. We have Democrats in Congress being bold and going big with their majority. We have tremendous congressional champions, two of which we are fortunate to have on our call today, who are leading the fight for housing investments. And we've built strong bipartisan support for these solutions, if not in Congress, then certainly throughout the country. The Build Back Better Act that Congress and the White House are negotiating now includes investments that would be transformational in our efforts to end homelessness in this country. Over 10 years, $90 billion for rental assistance could house an additional 1 million families. $80 billion for public housing would repair, preserve, and expand affordable homes to 2.5 million of the country's lowest income people. $37 billion for the Housing Trust Fund would build or preserve 330,000 homes affordable to the lowest income people. These investments could end homelessness. So these next few weeks are so important. The Build Back Better Act's top line number of $3.5 trillion will be reduced. House and Senate Democratic moderates are insisting on it. It could be lowered by $1 trillion or $2 trillion, we don't know. And then come the hard conversations about what within the bill get cut or eliminated. So our work in these hours and days ahead is to keep members of Congress focused on these essential housing investments and to ensure that any cuts to the overall bill don't come at the expense of housing our country's lowest income people. And now Democratic leadership are signaling that they may allow the bipartisan infrastructure bill to be voted on even before there's final agreement among the Democrats on how to move forward on reconciliation, which creates a very real risk that the whole reconciliation bill could fall apart. We can't let that happen. I honestly, I can't bear to think about our missing this moment, about having everything aligned so well and then allowing it to fall apart. We can't let it happen. So many people are counting on us and on Congress to get this right. People who are struggling, hungry, sleeping on sidewalks, in cars, in homeless shelters, in unsafe and unaffordable homes. Our neighbors who could be safely and stably housed with the investments in this bill, but only if Congress enacts it. This moment of opportunity won't come again for years or even decades. So now is the moment to do all we can to ensure that the reconciliation bill is enacted and that the HoUSed campaign's priorities for the bill are included. So I am going to now turn it over to our first speaker, Sarah Sadian from the NLIHC team, to talk in a little bit more detail about what's next on Capitol Hill and what you all can do. Sarah, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Diane. I couldn't have said it better myself. This week is incredibly important for Congress and its ability to pass the Build Better Act, which could include up to $327 billion in affordable housing, but there's a lot of uncertainty in the days and weeks ahead. What I see as being the biggest game changer here, which you alluded to, is Speaker Pelosi reversing the position that she's held for the last several months, requiring that in order to move the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the larger Build Back Better Act would have to pass at the same time. If you remember, she made that promise to progressives to keep those bills together because she was trying to hold together a very divided caucus and wanted to ensure that both bills could be enacted. But this decision to split those two bills and allow the bipartisan bill to get a vote as soon as Thursday could put the larger Build Back Better Act at risk. It could lower the incentives that moderates like Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin have for voting for that larger bill. So there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of unknowns about what lies ahead. We should learn more by Thursday, which is when, as I mentioned, Speaker Pelosi wants to have a vote on the bipartisan bill. Just as of less than an hour ago, the Progressive Caucus has said that they will vote against the bipartisan bill unless the Build Back Better Act moves at the same time. At the same time, of course, moderates are threatening to vote against the Build Back Better Act unless it is paired with the bipartisan bill. So there's a lot of uncertainty here, and it's one of the things I'm looking for is just how many progressives will end up voting against the bill and whether or not they'll even bring it up for a vote by the end of the week. To try to address the concerns that progressives have raised, Speaker Pelosi says that she wants to be able to vote this week on the Build Back Better Act. Sorry, there's a lot of B words there. But it's really hard to imagine that all of that is going to be wrapped up in time. We know that House and Senate leaders are still negotiating with moderates over the size of the package, about different provisions that will be in the bill, and they are still very far apart. Senate moderates haven't said anything publicly, at least, about what their demands are for this bill, how much they're willing to spend, and what needs to be included or not included. Leadership says that they're still hoping to secure some sort of a framework for understanding that negotiation so that they can have the buy-in up front from those Senate moderates. And ideally, that sort of a commitment, even if it's just for a framework, would be enough for progressives to move forward. But again, we just don't know how this high stakes negotiations is going to go. Some folks are hoping that they can have some of that framework done as soon as today. President Biden is speaking with both Sinema and Manchin sometime today. They just finished up the Sinema meeting. No readout on that just yet. But there are continued conversations that are happening. All we do know is that when the Build Back Better Act, if it moves forward, there will be significant changes that will be made. Those changes will be likely made in the Rules Committee before the bill goes to the House floor. So we are sort of in a moment of pause, but a moment of really great importance here while we see what happens over negotiations over our top line amount and how that impacts housing investments. At the end of the day, it's really important that we don't let up pressure on Congress to both pass the bill quickly and ensure that there are really robust investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. So please continue to call your member of Congress. Let them know that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that we cannot pass up, and that we need to have really significant investments in those three programs to help address homelessness and housing poverty. The second thing that you can all do is sign our national letter. I'm going to ask our colleagues if they can share a link to it in the chat box. We have over 1,500 organizations nationwide who are calling for those three investments and are urging Congress to fund them at no less than the amounts that were included in the House bill. We need this letter to have a really robust showing because it allows us to go to members of Congress, to go to leadership, and back them up in supporting a high allocation for those programs. So if you haven't signed on already, please do. And if you can share it with your partners, go for that too. I wanted to also share a quick update about what also is happening in other parts of Congress, which is adding to sort of the drama that's unfolding today or unfolding this week. Congress also has to pass a continuing resolution by the end of the week to avoid a government shutdown, but Republicans are sort of holding firm on their threat to vote against the measure as long as it is tied to a fix on the debt limit. Yesterday, Republicans voted against a procedural measure that would have allowed them to move forward. If they don't pass it by Friday, federal agencies will have to start shutting down everything but their most critical functions, with hundreds of thousands of employees on furlough and who are working without pay. We think it's very likely that Democrats are going to drop their debt ceiling fix from the CR package, and then ultimately Congress will be able to pass that this week to avoid a government shutdown. It seems like both Republicans and Democrats don't want to see that happen, and so there's enough pressure on them to get something done. But that still leaves Democrats with the need to fix the debt ceiling within the next couple of weeks. It is possible, although I think not ideal, according to House and Senate leadership, to attach a fix to the debt ceiling to the larger budget reconciliation bill. That would take a lot of time and would have a huge impact on the ability to pass the Build Back Better Act. It would require Democrats to have to go all the way back to step one to revise their budget resolution and to work that package through the process. All of which means that they're spending a lot of political capital to get that through. So with that, I just want to reiterate to folks how important this week is. If you haven't been engaging with your members of Congress, now is really the time to do it. We know that there are a lot of high-stake conversations and negotiations happening, and members of Congress and House and Senate leaders need to be hearing from you about why housing investments are so important. And with that, I will pause and hand it back to Diane to see if there's any other questions. And I see that Senator Schumer is on board, and so I'll turn back to you.
I believe he is. Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to check and see if Majority Leader Schumer is on and ready.
Senator Schumer will be on in just a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. So Sarah, we had a couple questions. You touched on it a bit, but maybe you can just explain a little bit more about how the debt ceiling, appropriations, reconciliation, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act are all tied together, and how they'll be, how it'll move forward.
Yeah, so what Congress is dealing with is like a series of deadlines that are all coming due starting this week. Speaker Pelosi had made a promise to House moderates that they would vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill this week, but there was already a pre-standing agreement with Speaker Pelosi with progressives that the only way that they would move forward with the bipartisan bill is if they also move forward with this larger economic recovery package. And I think it just is coming to a point where Speaker Pelosi isn't able to make good on both of those arrangements with moderates and progressives. She's trying to keep up with her good faith negotiation with moderates by holding a vote sometime this week, while working as quickly as possible to try to reach a negotiation with moderates over the economic recovery package. But all of that is sort of coming down to the wire, and we could see either a vote on Thursday, or you could see, if they don't have the votes for the bipartisan bill, you could see a vote just not take place, and Speaker Pelosi wouldn't bring it to the floor. So all of that's sort of wrapped up into the very immediate questions about how much is funded through the Build Back Better Act, what is prioritized. The CR and the debt ceiling are sort of an extra layer of difficulty. Like I said earlier, I think it's very likely that Congress will pass a continuing resolution to keep the government open starting on October 1st. But that debt ceiling limit could have an impact on the infrastructure conversations if Democrats feel like the only way they can address the debt ceiling limit issue is by going back, revising their budget resolution, and starting that process all over again. Unfortunately, they don't have any Senate Republicans who are willing to, do the financially responsible thing and lift the debt ceiling limit. And so they're trying to find ways that they can get around that and make sure that we don't default on our loans. If that were to happen, of course, that would have a tremendous impact on our economy and could have some really serious long-term consequences. So I know that Democrats in the House and Senate are working very hard to make sure they can avoid that challenge, but it does add another layer of uncertainty when it comes to this infrastructure bill and the timing of when it would move forward.
Thanks, Sarah. And looks like we have another minute or two. So can you share again the specific actions that we're asking everybody to take this week, starting today?
Okay, so starting today, we're asking all advocates to call their members of Congress and to encourage them to quickly enact the Build Better Act and to make sure that we're funding rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund at the highest possible levels. I'd say if you are thinking about who's the most important people for you to reach out to, if you have a member of Congress who's in the House or Senate leadership, they are the most important for you to engage with. If you have a member who's on either the Senate Banking Committee or the House Financial Services Committee, they are extremely important in advocating for enough resources for housing. And then more generally, I'd say any Democratic member that you have, probably not a good use of your time to reach out to Republicans right now. That's okay. Focus on your Democrats, especially moderates as well, to make sure that they understand how important these housing investments are.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And I believe that the Majority Leader is with us now. So as he's getting settled, I want to introduce him. Senator Chuck Schumer from New York serves as the Senate Majority Leader, one of the most powerful positions in government. And under his leadership, Congress enacted historic protections and resources to help renters and people experiencing homelessness stay safely and stably housed during the pandemic. Now he is leading efforts to enact President Biden's Build Back Better proposal, which could include up to $327 billion in housing investments, as we've been talking about, including robust funding for the HoUSed campaign's top priorities: rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. So Senator Schumer, we are so honored and pleased to have you back on this call. Thank you for fighting for targeted affordable housing investments, and thank you for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Diane. I'm sorry I'm going to have to be brief. I do have just about the perfect excuse. President Biden set up a call for me and Speaker Pelosi at 3 o'clock. So I'll have to be brief. I apologize. You know, when the president sets the time, my schedule has to bend and be flexible, as you could imagine. Okay, so thank you. And I want to thank Diane for the nice introduction. I want to thank all of you for the incredible hard work that you have been doing to fight our housing priorities, especially for the most vulnerable, and especially during this pandemic. Throughout COVID, I've been saying how clear it is that housing policy is public health policy. From CARES to the American Rescue Plan, we've delivered historic and truly progressive assistance to keep families safely in their homes, fed and healthy, and avoid overwhelming debt. I've been leading the charge to make sure that housing gets an increase in all of these. And here's what we've done so far: $46 billion in rental assistance, expansions to CTC and EITC, which help people pay the rent, tens of billions for homelessness through ESG home and emergency housing vouchers, 15% increase in SNAP. And I pushed really hard for all of these, and particularly on housing, because I've always felt it's sort of the neglected stepchild. As you know, President Biden proposed about $100 billion in housing, and we pushed in the Senate, myself, Senator Brown, to move it up to 300. Through the policies and assistance provided in the previous emergency relief packages, we've been able to keep millions of families in their homes instead of on the street. And the truth is that ultimately, I think we came as close as we ever have. You guys still got a ways to go to greatly reducing or eliminating or greatly reducing homelessness in our country. So now's the time to double down on these policies that support families and make sure we're not just able to make it through the crisis, but also emerge stronger from this recovery. And due in large part to the advocacy of so many of the groups on this Zoom, the House Financial Services, working closely for weeks with our office, House leadership, and Senate Banking Committee led by Sherrod Brown, has advanced the largest investment in affordable housing since the Great Society. And as I said, this was one of the main things I pushed for in changes from the Biden plan, which was a good plan to begin with. Now, I want to quickly go through how transformative these housing policies can be and discuss the path forward to get them on the president's desk. Public housing first. For decades, our public housing has been seriously underfunded. I've been to so many of these developments in New York, and people are paying very high rents for really junky conditions. And tenants are now dealing with quality of life issues and much more urgently, health and safety issues, lead, mold, things that must be fixed. The president proposed $40 billion for public housing. This was a great start. I give him a huge amount of credit, but every one of us knew it wasn't enough. In New York, NYCHA alone has a capital repair need of close to $40 billion. So I led the fight for $80 billion so that we could address the entire backlog of repairs and upgrades for public housing to ensure safe and decent living conditions. I know that you were with us every step of the way, but please continue to contact your senators and representatives to keep that $80 billion for public housing, particularly, as you know, when the president negotiates with Senators Manchin and Sinema, we may have to cut the top line. I don't want to see public housing cut. Vouchers. In the American Rescue Plan, as you know, we made a down payment of $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers for individuals and families at risk of homelessness. But we all know the need for safe, decent, affordable housing is far greater than that amount. That's why we made increasing the supply of housing choice vouchers a priority in this package. And as you know, the vouchers prioritize individuals and families who've been most affected by the pandemic and they're most in need of secure and safe housing. Extremely low income households, families experiencing homelessness, victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. As you know, when families have safe and secure housing, not only do they have lower rates of eviction, but they have improved everything else: mental health, lower health and hospitalization risks, higher academic achievement. When you're in a home and a decent home, a lot of the rest falls into place. On the Housing Trust Fund, home, and on down payment assistance, we've increased all three of these because it's not only the demand for affordable housing is one part of the problem, we need to supply affordable housing as well. So that's what we've done with Housing Trust Fund and Home for construction, purchase, and rehab of affordable homes for low-income families. Right now, we have such an incredible demand for housing. It's pushing rental prices and home prices up for everybody. Building additional housing supply for low-income families reduces housing costs for everybody. And finally, we're putting billions in for the first time, first generation down payment assistance. I'm very excited about that. Access to home ownership has been the single best path for families to build intergenerational wealth. And we want to make sure we have that. So going forward, the process of making these big transformative laws like this is bumpy, but I'm confident that we're ultimately going to pass both bills. We've got to get both bills done. As you know, the first bill, the BIF bill, doesn't have anything for housing. So the President, Speaker Pelosi, and I have said we have to have the two-track approach and do both. And we in the Senate are resolute on trying to keep that approach. I hope you will join us in that. Our goal is to ensure the major initiatives proposed we've discussed get enacted and robustly funded in each bill, and that certainly includes our housing priorities. That said, the political reality is we need the support of our entire caucus, which means negotiating with our moderate members in the House and Senate, and we're doing that now. I'm confident we can come to an agreement that includes these priorities. So I'm going to fight for them, and I ask you to do the same. We need to do it. This is a unique and wonderful opportunity. It's not going to happen without hard work and some sweat, but I know we're all up to the task. Thanks very much, and have a great rest of the conference. Sorry to be so quick.
Thank you so much, Majority Leader. We appreciate your leadership on affordable housing. We will keep fighting. Thank you for all you're doing, and thanks for joining the call. And please share our thanks with President Biden as well.
Thank you. I will, Diane. Thank you very much.
So we are also talking about, as we have been every week during these national house calls, about how essential it is to prevent evictions during the pandemic and certainly after the pandemic. So the resources that Majority Leader Schumer just laid out and that we talked about earlier in the call are to help build a real housing safety net to avoid us coming to the brink of an eviction tsunami in another pandemic or natural disaster, or even just in the next year. And in the meantime, we have unprecedented resources from Congress for emergency rental assistance to help tenants who fell behind during the pandemic to get current on their rent, to help landlords get the rent that they need to continue to pay their bills. So I'm really pleased to welcome back to our national call Jean Sperling, who's been with us several times over the last few months. Jean is formerly the head of the National Economic Council under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and he is now a senior advisor to President Biden, who appointed him to oversee the implementation of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, including, of course, the $46.5 billion for emergency rental assistance, for which he's worked really hard to ensure that they reach the tenants who need it the most. So Jean, I really, as always, appreciate your leadership and hard work in preventing evictions, in getting emergency rental assistance to tenants and landlords who need it. And I appreciate you joining the call. And I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Jean.
Thank you very much, Diane, for again letting me address your call of so many amazing advocates and nonprofits and people fighting every day on the ground and in their legislators and in Congress to do all the things that you and both the Majority Leader Schumer talked about in terms of the importance of housing, stability and security for health and for dignity and for economic security. I've been on this call several times. I guess what I'd say about this one is perhaps this is the day with data that we could say the following, which is not much different than I hear Diane saying all the time, which is we can now show that we have made meaningful progress. We just also can show that we have a long way to go. The efforts that people are doing, it's important to recognize when you are, both when you're making a difference and when you're not nearly there. The combination of the constant pressure and focus from us, but also from all of you to get emergency rental assistance money out is clearly making a meaningful difference. It's also clear that there is still a meaningful and painful gap that could still lead to hundreds of thousands of unnecessary evictions and the heartbreak and devastation that results from them. Now, some of the data was a little more encouraging recently in a couple of ways. One, the August numbers did increase by 35%. To $2.3 billion alone in the month of August, and 420,000 emergency rental assistance payments to households. Those are unquestionably meaningful numbers. Indeed, that is a tripling of money per month and people getting payments per month from just May. So it's worth noting, again, as I think Diane Low-Income Housing Coalition has focused repeatedly, that it is a story of higher performance in some places and weaker performance in other places when we need absolutely strong performance everywhere. Now, on the positive side, there are now 88 jurisdictions that are over 70% of their ERA 1 money. By the end of August, 144 over 50%. 31 are actually over 100%, and there's even 10 that have gone through all of their ERA money, and 10 and the majority of their ERA 2 funds. I mean, the places that are at 100%, we talk a lot about, certain places, but we're also talking about Richland County, South Carolina, Baton Rouge. It is clear that with the leadership, with using the right flexibilities, that focusing on self-attestation, working on court diversion, working with community groups who are able to reach the people in need, who are culturally expert in doing so, can work almost anywhere. We saw some big improvements. New Jersey, went from 42% to 87%. We've seen states like Texas and Virginia performing well. But the other side of the story is just as striking. There are 14 states that have allocated less than 10% of their funds by the end of August, 14 states. So we've got a long way to go, and we've got to, we can't just focus on the averages as they get better, but look at where there's real pain and hardship happening because of the failure to successfully allocate these funds that so many people here worked hard to get legislated. Now, I would say that in looking at the amount of money that we have got out and the people, it is worth looking at the pace and what continuing that pace would mean. It would mean meaningful progress and would also not be enough. So at 420,000 a month, we would be doing 2.1 million ERA payments would be going out between August and the end of the year for a total of 3 million. 3 million ERA payments out in 2021, no doubt is going to help a very significant number of people. At this pace, we would probably spend about $16.7 billion in 2021. Again, it's one of the things we try to do is try to look and assess how much of the demand are we meeting, how much is falling through the cracks. It doesn't really affect us in the sense that we're not going to be satisfied until we're doing everything we can to prevent all preventable evictions. In making that determination, I really do discourage people from just judging how one's done in 5 or 6 months versus the 46.5 billion. I think that does tend to discredit the amount that is happening. That money, the 25 billion, is usable to September 2022. The 21.5 billion under ERA is allowable till September 2024. These were not necessarily funds that were all meant to go out in 2021. So we're trying to look and assess the need. How many people are not just a little behind in the rent, but at risk of eviction? How much is the debt of those people? I think when you look at that, you will see that all of the work you have done is mattering, that perhaps we're on pace to meet well over half of that demand. And we all know that's not enough. That would still mean hundreds of thousands of families would fall through the cracks, would be evicted when there were funds to deal with them. So I guess if there's a theme to my presentation is there really is meaningful progress and there really is a meaningful gap that is remaining. Now, today in the Washington Post, you saw some other data, which I think is important to, again, recognize the positive implications, but to not let us or anyone else start thinking we're anywhere close to having our work done. It is true that in the 4 weeks since the end of the eviction moratorium, our worst fears do not seem to have materialized. There has not been an unprecedented surge, as best we can tell from the numbers that come out from Eviction Lab and legal service corporations and others. In fact, it's suggesting that we're only around half of historic averages. I think everybody on this call knows it's still way too early to tell. We also know there's enormous uncertainty and lack of really great information in our national eviction infrastructure. So we do not know how many people did self-evictions. And even if we did, we wouldn't really know how to compare it to past years. Is this just early? Could there be things that would lead to larger spikes? Could it be negatively impacted by, if the Delta, ends up being more problematic for the economy, if some people are affected by losing their unemployment, or the other side, is the child tax credit helping people? Is the, signs the labor market still strengthening? So I think that we should feel a certain relief that it does not look like we're having an unprecedented surge, but I think it's way too early. The information is way too uncertain, and there may be some explanations that are not as positive, like judges who weren't enforcing it, and therefore you didn't see the spike. That said, I do think that this is a sign that that 420,000 payments, that all of the work on eviction, diversion, and state local moratoriums and continuing the national moratoriums has mattered. And I think when you look at that 420,000 a month, which we hope will accelerate, but you can see that everything everybody's doing to delay, to provide more rental protections, to have more moratorium helps. If you have 500,000 payments going out a month, that can be helpful, but if 3 million people need it all in September or October, it won't be as helpful. So all of these efforts, both in getting the funds out, but also in diversion, in legal representation in more state and local moratoriums, in renter protections, or you can't be evicted if you've applied for your emergency rental assistance. I think they all work together. The more those are delayed, the more we can modify, the greater likelihood that the emergency rental assistances can make a bigger impact going forward. A couple of positive signs on the emergency rental assistance are that the majority is going to people 30% and under of poverty. This is something that Low Income Housing Coalition pushed with us from the start. Focus on the people who are at the greatest level of poverty. That would suggest this could be very helpful in evictions. The eviction lab also shows that those places that have done the best getting out their emergency rental assistance are seeing less evictions. So we have a long way to go. What I would just say when in my last comment is, when Diane talks about this being, you know, a once in a life moment right now, of course, passing the Build Back Better plan, I think of it as once in a lifetime too, to do something major and lasting on the on our whole national policy or lack of policy on evictions. You know, we all know we had 3.6 million eviction filings before we had a crisis per year. Now we have a chance. And one thing about the fact that that 46.5 billion could last for a few years that is positive is we have a chance to get in lasting reform, to set up these structures, to get them going, to work through the kinks, to get more eviction diversion programs in courts, to get more cities working with community groups and distributing funds, to fight for the right to counsel and advocacy for people. These are things that if we get in place, could make a significant difference. The next thing you will see coming from the administration will be more detail on the one stick this law gave us that we finally have, which is reallocation. I want to make clear that while we are happy that we do now have a little bit more ability to have a little more impact, and again, a little more stick and carrot to promote strong performances. This is not about reward and punishment. It is about speeding effective relief to families in need of housing security and eviction protection. So when we look at how to do this, when you see the Deputy Secretary talk more about this in the next few days, you're going to see that yes, we're going to make clear to people who are not performing that they are at risk of reallocation, and that there are the high performers who are going to not get funds because they're being rewarded, because they need more to meet the need in their community. But when we do, we're going to be looking to improve performance. We want to use that reallocation authority to get more people to do attestations, to simplify processes, to work with courts on eviction diversion, to work with more advocacy, right to counsel, to have partnerships. So again, we're going to use that power not just for reward and arbitrary punishment, but to encourage those behaviors that will speed relief, the ones you all have rightly recommended to this administration and pressed, and also the ones that could make a lasting difference and turn a kind of once in a lifetime emergency funds into a real policy and strategy for long-term reform, so that eviction policy, so that evictions will not be this terrible hole in our national economic security network, as it has been, unfortunately, for too many decades before us. So thank you very much for all everyone's doing. Thank you to Diane, the Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for repeatedly allowing me to come on and talk to you and to have this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Always appreciate you joining and appreciate all of your thoughts and insights. We do have a few questions if you have time. I wanted to share first a few comments that came in as you talked about the data being clear in some places that evictions are below pre-pandemic rates, that some people are weighing in with data showing that in some communities, the eviction rates are quite high. And Zoe Middleton from Houston shares that over the last 2 weeks, Harris County, Houston is seeing the highest filing rates of evictions since the pandemic began. And Claudia Swaney noting that in many communities across the country, we're seeing increased homelessness, both encampments and increased number of people going to homeless shelters. And as you said, I couldn't agree more that nearly 1.5 million families helped with emergency rental assistance is meaningful progress, and that the overall rate of spending is too slow and many communities need to do better. And the fact that some communities are doing it so well shows that it's possible, and makes those that aren't all the more unacceptable. And we know the reasons why many of these communities are still spending funding much too slowly. And in many cases, it's because they are not following very clear Treasury and White House guidance, and they're not adopting evidence-based best practices. So you talked about self-attestation. There's still fewer than 17% of programs that are allowing it for income or housing instability. So I think I appreciate the incentives that the Department of Treasury and White House continues to use to motivate and encourage programs to improve. And clearly in some places it's working, but it's not working everywhere. And so my question is, what are the consequences for programs that continue to ignore clear White House and Treasury guidance and are not getting the money out? What can be the consequences for some of those programs?
So on the first point, I just want to say to everyone out there, and of course, you always try to say things clearly, and maybe you don't say clear enough. Just because I recognize some progress or some numbers that perhaps are a little better than expect does not mean that we're satisfied or it's enough. I do believe it is important that people understand that these things can work. And so showing that it's having an impact and showing that it's working very well in some places is important to show people, public out there, yes, this can work. The efforts that people are making do make a difference. I think when you do that, you always have to be careful that you're not trying to say we're done or people should be satisfied. And I have tried always in all of my comments to be as careful as possible. I think on the points about as I've said, and I've said this publicly, it is way too early to tell the numbers. We don't know. People could be self-evicting. You could also have a spike, but the spike goes back to historic levels and is not double or triple. Is that a good news or a bad news story? Well, it's not as terrible as some of us might have feared, but it's not a good news story. The truth is, we take the Build Back Better view seriously. Getting back to historic average is not good enough. You're getting back to a terrible situation in our country where people are being evicted every year. But it's worse this year because we have the funds to ensure that you could have very low levels. So what I wanted more to say was that things that slow eviction, like moratorium, like diversion, like right to counsels, do help with the eviction payments, that all of those efforts together can work together. So I have no question, we think this is still an urgent situation. Every eviction is a heartbreak. Every avoidable eviction is an avoidable heartbreak. And so no, we think it is way, way too early to tell. And to be honest, we would never really have the numbers to know. And we know that there's many places where there's just enormous suffering. I met with 20 tenants who had been evicted just recently. Many of them were in places where money was flowing out okay, and they still did not get their help and suffered huge consequences for their family. And all of you are dealing with that every day. So again, when I say we've made meaningful progress, as I think we have, you have to add every time, but there is a long way to go. There are meaningful gaps. There are gaps that will lead to unnecessary pain and hardship for hundreds of thousands. So just want to make that very clear. One of the discussions we've had for a long time is that these funds, we have tried to use all of the tools we've had. We've tried to use guidance, and we have, I think, used guidance effectively. I do believe this last August 25th that really spelled out in as clear language as possible that you could do self-attestation for all three categories of eligibility, that you could do it on your initial application, has been effective. We have just heard repeatedly from different places we are talking about that has broken through with them and that they are doing better. But I will say that up till September 30th, if you ask, what are we going to do? I'm not going to pretend that we had a recoupment authority or that we had a penalty that we could do. What I'm saying now is that now September 30th and beyond, we have the capacity to reallocate funds. And the point I'm trying to say is that we're not looking at that as let's punish poor performers and give rewards to high performers. We're looking for that, Diane, exactly to say, if you've been underperforming, we want to, now we can say, we need to see you doing self-attestation. We need to see you doing this. And for the first time, there can be consequences if there's not. So our entire strategy on reallocation is going to be exactly, again, not punishment and reward, but using that power to encourage and to get people to using simplified processes, to using self-attestation, to speeding their delivery, to working with community groups better in that distribution, and to working with their courts on diversion. Again, the deputy secretary will be giving out more details on that, and I'll let him do that. But I think I can tell you this is the philosophy and the approach that you will see both in the guidance and in how we use this authority that we finally now have.
Thanks, Jane. And I know too that you and your colleagues are giving really careful thought, as we've recommended, to ensure that, and during the recapture and reallocation process, that tenants are held harmless for what may be their poorer performing program. So if a program is not getting the money out quickly, but there's remaining need in that community, I know you're paying careful attention to how to ensure that those tenants still get the money that they need.
Absolutely. It makes no sense for us to, essentially to say, here's tenants, vulnerable low-income tenants who've been underserved by their government, and our response is to punish them. It's not. Reallocation has to be first of all, we hope it will be a strategy that will make those grantees serve those folks better. But if not, that we are figuring out how those governments, either voluntarily or by force, are going to get the hands into those who can do that. But this is, I do believe we are in a stronger situation. The more places that succeed, the less excuse there is for those who don't. People are dealing with the end of there's not much good, or there's nothing good about the end of the national eviction moratorium, except perhaps it is forcing people to move this up to the top of the agenda. And now, for those who have not got the funds out, the pressure is on that to either prove they're on the way to doing that or to show they're doing the reforms. And I promise you, things like self-attestation will be at the very top of that list, because we know, look, I talk to lots of people, and I will tell you that, it's not like when you talk to people who are slow performers, you get off the phone feeling like they're terrible people, or they don't care, or they're not conscientious. They just have not made the commitment to getting the money out efficiently, and they're prioritizing other things beyond getting the capacity and the speed and the self-attestation. We've been in a persuasion and a cajoling and a guidance game up till now. Now we have the ability to say, if If you're a slow performer, there are consequences, but we're not just here to punish you now. We're here to say, show us how you're going to use self-attestation, speed up. That's the goal. The goal is to use this to get better performance and effectiveness for the people who are being underserved. And we will, we will have, guidance. The Deputy Secretary Treasurer will make an announcement relatively soon. And when that happens, our door is open to talk with all of you about, once you understand what we're doing, how, what we should be doing to get advice in this process. Because now this process of reallocation goes on for ERA 1, later for ERA 2. This is now a very strong tool that we now have to encourage better performance, speedier performance, that we haven't really had up till this moment.
Absolutely. And I know we're about out of time, and you've been very generous with your time as always. We have so many more questions than we can have you answer today. So you and I will stay in touch, and I'll share them with you, and we'll get answers out to everybody else as soon as we can. But I just want to thank you and thank your colleagues for all that you've done. And I agree that the guidance that you put out recently was very helpful and made a clear difference. And we have seen numerous programs course correcting, early on Texas, but more recently California, New York, Connecticut, South Carolina, Arkansas, all places that had challenged programs from the beginning, heard the feedback, saw the best practices, are starting to embed them in their programs, and now we're starting to see them getting the money out more quickly. So really
I just talked with one place that because of the self-attestation, they're now having people call, and that city is filling them out for them. So there's a lot of things happening. And I just want to assure everybody, look, I want this program to be a success. When there's progress, we're going to mention the progress, but I just want to reassure you, we know how that there is a big gap, and how painful it is. Evictions, is as devastating for a family, leads to as much of a downward cycle, has as much health risk as anything. And we are, even if we're making, I'm happy that we are able to show, after all the work people have done, that there is some meaningful progress. But I want everybody to know, we believe, we are saying at every moment there is a meaningful gap as well, and it's a painful gap, and we won't sleep well at night until we're closing all of it.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks so much for your leadership, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
So to talk a little bit more about some of the latest ERA spending numbers, which came out last week, and some of the guidance as well, I'm going to turn it over first to Emma Foley, a research analyst at NLIHC, to talk about those numbers. Emma?
Great, thank you. So last Friday, the 24th, the U.S. Department of Treasury released updated emergency rental assistance spending data through August 31st. And today I'll just provide some overall highlights. Some of those have already been mentioned, but this will just provide kind of an overarching look at the data. So in August, programs spent an additional $2.28 billion in ERA 1, bringing the total ERA 1 assistance provided to $7.1 billion. This represents 28% of the initial ERA 1 allocation. And after only a slight increase in spending between June and July, August did have a substantial increase in the rate of spending. Grantees spent $550 million more in August than they did in July. And in comparison, they only spent $196 million more in July than they did in June. Overall, nearly 1.4 million households have received ERA funding through August, and 400,000 of these households were served in August alone. But as both Jean and Diane have noted, despite this progress, many programs continue to spend an insufficient amount of funds to help those in need and aren't implementing critical features like self-attestation, directed tenant assistance, and targeted outreach. Next slide. States spent 26% of their funding by August 31st. In comparison, at the end of July, states had spent 16% of their ERA1 allocation. Several state programs continue to lag behind, including Arkansas, Nebraska, Arizona, North Dakota, and South Dakota, all of which spent less than 5% of their allocation as of the end of August. Several other larger states, such as Florida, have spent less than 10%. On the other hand, 8 states have now spent more than 40% of their allocation, with New Jersey, DC, Virginia, and Texas leading fund distribution. Several states have also showed impressive increases in their funding distribution, including New York and North Carolina. Localities have spent 42% of their allocations, up from 31% at the end of July. And over 100 localities are now spending more than half of their allocations, while several local programs have yet to reach 5%. Next slide. NLIHC is continuing to track both ERA spending and obligations in real time as well. Since it has been nearly a month since August 31st, which is when the Treasury data is current as of, our estimates are higher than the most recent Treasury data, incorporating some of what has been spent in September. As of September 27th, we've tracked $9.35 billion spent or obligated from the initial $25 billion ERA1 allocation. This data is regularly updated on our ERA dashboard at nlihc.org/ERA-dashboard. This data only includes ERA1 spending for now, but we do plan on incorporating ERA2 data shortly, since ERA2 data was also just released in the most recent Treasury data. Next slide. And then lastly, this table just shows the breakdown of spending by program type. Using both the most recent Treasury data as well as more recent data from dashboards and program administrators, we're tracking that state programs have paid or obligated approximately $6.8 billion of their ERA1 allocation, and local programs have paid or obligated $2.5 billion of their ERA1 allocation. Next slide. And then, as always, if you know of any data dashboards or other spending data updates to inform our tracking, please do feel free to email that information to research@nlihc.org. And if you have any questions about our tracking or the Treasury data, those questions can be sent there as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Gallagher to talk about the ERASE project.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Emma. I'm Sarah Gallagher, and I just want to take a minute to update you on the ERASE project and highlight one of our projects in our weekly project spotlight. So as you heard from Jean and Diane and Emma, all programs are ramping up and many programs are doing well. And here at NLIHC, we are really working hard to collate all of the resources and research and best practices to support a cohort of grantees who are working on the ground to ensure that ERA funding is getting out to those most in need. So they're utilizing our best practices to create innovations and engagement, to influence their state and local programs, and to really connect ERA to the state and local court systems in order to lay the framework for sustainability and tenant protections that will last long term. Today, I'm here to highlight one of our grantees, the Chicago Anti-Eviction campaign, and we're going to hear from J.R. Fleming and their project. And you can just go to the next slide, or there you go, or not to the next slide, to that. Thank you. As you'll see, their project is focusing on two of our ERASE strategies that JR will talk about. They're focusing on landlord education and engagement to really help landlords know about emergency rental assistance and to learn how to access it. They're creating eviction prevention assistance and legal services interventions to really meet the needs of the most vulnerable tenants. And they're engaging in strategies to expand the housing supply of affordable housing in Chicago. So I am very excited to hand it over to JR as our ERASE program spotlight this week. So JR, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me turn this camera on. All right, can folks see me? All right, here we go. My name is J.R. Fleming. First of all, let me thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition We are an erased grantee, and I also want to thank Congress and Senate for getting the funds out that they did get out. We truly appreciate it. Our organization has been working on, as you stated, eviction diversion, eviction tenant, and landlord assistance, with a main focus on multifamily property owners who traditionally do not negotiate with folks, their tenants, on providing what do we call them, grace periods. So we've been able to match up several big landlords with some state resources, city resources, and county. In terms of legal services, I do want to highlight that to get to legal services, you got to have an effective outreach plan. One of the best ones I heard today was the one that Jane mentioned about being culturally sensitive to outreach. And one of the things we do to be culturally sensitive is we have an outreach team known as a street team that flyers, right? Get out information about what our program is doing, other nonprofits, what the city has available, what the county has available, and what the state has available. Our flyering attempts goes all the way out to the community in terms of grocery stores, restaurants, barbershops, schools. And I want to talk a little bit more about schools in a minute. We're launching our social media and website campaign this weekend to get folks resources because a lot of our local programs will be kicking off October 4th. In terms of advocacy, well, I'm gonna stay on legal. In terms of legal, our state has allocated $60 million for court-based rental assistance. So I do want to highlight that. Our local Cook County government has put together a legal service program that gives a lot of tenants in the county an opportunity to find free legal services. In terms of advocacy, I want to shout out starting locally, the city of Chicago. The mayor recently announced a $9 million program that would assist students a one-time payment who are struggling with rent. So I do want to highlight some of the effectiveness of organizing, right? Again, collective organizing that has happened, not just with us, but with another erased grantee, Housing Action Illinois, have been able to impact the city, the county, and the state already. In terms of locally, our city is overwhelmed with applications. They're the only system currently that is not online in terms of rental assistance. Our Cook County government will be opening up their portal for rental assistance on October 4th. And they, in addition to the 60 million, have already allocated most of their $73 million they had earmarked for rental assistance. On the state level, our governor committed $500 million to rental assistance, of which $329 million has been allocated, and then an additional $300+ million, which is historic, towards utilities assistance, which is connected to housing. I want to shout out our partners, Resistance Legal Clinic. As always, their legal partnerships, are one of our strongholds. Outside of getting tenants rental assistance dollars and landlords, we want to make sure that tenants also have legal counsel standing by, not just from the government, but from trusted nonprofits. And then there's a part I want to talk about in terms of more work that we could be doing. Again, I want to highlight the National Low Income Housing Coalition, coming from a nonprofit side. Thanks to their funding processes, we now have nonprofits able to provide rental assistance. And that's money that's not granted through the city, county, state, or federal government, but money granted through national partners like National Low Income Housing Coalition. I didn't want to take up too much time. I hope I covered enough.
That's great, JR, you did. And thank you so much for joining the call and for sharing an update on your work. We'll look forward to having you back on in the future to share further updates. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn now to another field update that we have coming from Idaho. Angelica Moran, who's a policy specialist with Idaho Voices for Children, Idaho Asset Building Network. Angelica, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. So my name's Angelica Moran, and I'm a policy specialist with Idaho Voices for Children and the Idaho Asset Building Network. So a little bit about our organization. So Idaho Voices for Children is a nonprofit that drives change in the areas of child safety and well-being, health and access to care, education and school readiness, and family economic security. And then the Idaho Asset Building Network is a program of Idaho Voices for Children that pursues the same mission by ensuring that every Idahoan has access to an affordable home. So for a field update, I really want to talk about our day of action that we had on August 25th that really elevated those housing investments, especially those House Ed priorities in the budget reconciliation process. So what got us to wanting one day to really take action? So throughout our calls, even this call, NLIHC members have really emphasized how these investments are really historic investments and a once in a generation opportunity. So we really wanted to make sure that we did all we can on our end to really elevate those investments and the impact that it can have, not only on our nation, but for Idahoans. So some of the activities that took place for a day of action, we started off by hosting a webinar that really talked about Idaho's housing landscape and the different gaps we're seeing in our state, and then those long-term policy solutions that are needed in order to create change. And then we ended by talking about how our community can really take action at the federal level and how they can be housing advocates. And we did that by really highlighting our advocacy toolkit that we created for the community to use. We know that taking action at the federal level can be intimidating. So we really wanted to prep our community members to take action during the following day on August 25th on our day of action. So then to follow up and really give our community the opportunity to contact their members of Congress, we decided to create an email action tool that we had on our website that just made it easy for them to click on that link, and it had different talking points about the investment, and it just made it easier for them to contact their members of Congress. And then on our day of action, we shared the link on our social media, on our newsletter, and then also asked our coalition members to share it with their network. So then to follow up our day of action, we also set up meetings with our congressional delegation and really targeting them. And some of our coalition members were able to join us on those calls to bring in that multi-sector lens and really give them the opportunity to talk about how housing impacts healthcare and housing and hunger and housing and so forth. And overall, the meetings went really great. They really asked for more resources and information about what housing looks like in Idaho and the programs we have right now. So it was really great to hear that housing is really on their minds right now. So then to continue our day of action, we had a virtual press conference, our first one. It was virtual through Zoom. And then again, we talked about Idaho's housing landscape, and then we had five of our coalition members join us to, again, elevate housing from their multi-sector lens. So we had folks talking about healthcare and housing, hunger and housing, fair housing, economic mobility, and so forth. And then we ended our press conference by, again, elevating those housing investments in the budget reconciliation and asking our Congress to take action. And then to follow, we sent a press release that same day after the press conference, just for folks who weren't able to make it. And then we also recorded it and posted it on our Facebook. It got over 80 views, so it was really great. And just moving forward, we're really working on creating a plan to better engage our local media, since they're not used to really covering federal advocacy. They usually mostly cover state advocacy. So then to follow up our day of action, a couple weeks later, we sent a sign-on letter, again, just giving our coalition members the opportunity to sign on to it and advocate for the housing investment in the budget reconciliation. So again, to just continue to push our congressional delegation to take action and let them know that Idahoans are really wanting these investments for our state. So really the highlight of our event was just how really amazing our coalition, our multi-sector coalition members are, and just the dedication that they have for housing advocacy. When we were planning this event, we made sure to think of activities that made it easy for them to take action and participate in. So if they had limited capacity, it was easy as just like sharing our email action tool or signing on to our letter. Or if they wanted to be a little more involved or hands-on, they were able to participate in our congressional meetings or our press conference. So it was just really great to see our community, our media, our coalition members come together this day and take action and let our congressional delegation know that these housing investments are very needed in our state. So with that, thank you, Diane, for having us and letting us talk a little bit about the work we're doing here in Idaho.
Thanks, Angelica. We have a few comments and questions. Eric Kingston says, Brava, Angelica, the IABN is one of Idaho's greatest champions for equity and positive action. And we had multiple people asking for a link to the advocacy toolkit that you worked on. And I see my colleague Elena already put that link in the chat box, and we'll certainly share it as follow-up information as well. And a question about what you would say was the most effective part of either the advocacy toolkit or any of the other actions that you took.
I would definitely say that like having that webinar to really prep our community and folks to take action, because like I mentioned, it can be very intimidating to advocate at the federal level, or if thinking that like, is it worth it? Will my voice like actually be heard? So just using that as like an encouragement for them to take action, and then giving them the opportunities the next day and make it easy for them to do that.
Thanks very much, Angelica. Really appreciate all of your good work and appreciate you sharing it with us today.
Thank you.
So we are waiting for our final speaker, Chairman Sherrod Brown, who just had to go quickly, I believe, to take a vote, which is important. We understand that he needs to vote. So he'll be back soon. And in the meantime, I'm going to see Sarah Sadian. If you are, oh, I see actually Senator Brown has joined now.
Diane, how are you?
Oh, wonderful. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see
Thank
you.
So much for joining. I'll introduce you to everybody on the call, although I don't think you really need any introduction, but Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio has been a lifelong champion of low-income families. He currently serves as the chair of the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, where he played really a critical role in enacting tens of billions of dollars in housing resources during the pandemic, including emergency rental assistance, emergency housing vouchers, and other resources. And he and Chair Maxine Waters are now leading the fight for the $327 billion in housing investments in the reconciliation bill, including robust funding for the HoUSed campaign's top priorities of rental assistance, public housing, and the National Housing Trust Fund. So Chairman Brown, thank you as always for your leadership, and thank you for joining the call.
Diane, thank you. And I'm thrilled to be with you. And all of us in the banking housing staff love Diane and the work she does. And I was hoping I didn't, no offense to all of you, but I was hoping the administration would steal her away from you and make her one of the top jobs in housing, and who knows what the future is. But Diane, thank you, thank you, thank you. She is more than any single person in town whom we go to when we want advice on housing. So thanks for the work you've done, and thanks for the work that all of you at NLIHC do for housing. And we know there's no more important issue in the country than that people have a clean, accessible, safe, affordable place to live. So thank you. As Diane said, I took over as chair of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. This committee has been known around here by the media and by senators mostly as just the Banking Committee or simply Senate Banking. You will never hear me call it that. I always call it Banking and Housing, or sometimes I call it Housing and Banking, because it's such an important priority. But we also know that the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee has been far too much for years about Wall Street, far too little about housing, far too little about public transit, which increasingly interwoven with housing is so important in so many people's lives. You know that Diane joined us at the testified committee's first hearing in 9 years on the state of housing in America. We've held hearings on the legacy of racism in housing, from the Black codes to Jim Crow to redlining, to the Trump administration locking in discriminatory housing, discriminatory housing overall. We've had hearings on rural housing. We brought in the CEOs of the 6 largest banks. We've had hearings on climate, first time ever in this committee. And we recognize one big thing, that is that safe, stable, affordable housing is the gateway to opportunity, a healthy life. And too many Americans simply put are locked out of it. It's too expensive. It's too hard to find. And that's communities everywhere. Some of you have heard me, and I know Diane's heard this ad nauseum. My wife and I live in Cleveland in zip code 44105, and that zip code had more foreclosures in the year 2007, the first half of that year, than any zip code in the United States. And you still see the remnants, the residue, what's remained after that terrible period in our history. You also know 1/4 of all renters pay half their income in housing. You know what that means. One thing goes wrong, your car breaks down, your job gets shipped overseas, you have a workplace injury, may only keep you out for 3 or 4 weeks. You have a child get sick, any of those things can happen, and your life is just turned upside down. Too many people face eviction, too many people end up without a roof over their head. And that 1 out of 4 renters was prior to the pandemic, and we know what happens with evictions in the middle of the pandemic. That's why back in the March recovery bill, we worked with all of you to provide additional help for people experiencing homelessness, working with the organizations that serve them, passed emergency rental assistance to help more people stay in their homes in the first place. We know that assistance has been far too hard to access for literally millions of American families. We work to get the word out, to encourage state and local governments to work with organizations like all of yours to simplify programs to spread the word. Courts in Ohio, I did an event with the Republican Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Ohio, who's really understands the importance of housing, and she is encouraging judges in the state that before they evict anybody, when somebody comes in front of them, that they work with local groups like yours and all other kinds of pro-housing groups, housing advocates, to find ways to plug into those rental assistance dollars. Things have gotten better. Janet Yellen, Secretary Yellen testified today of the improvements, but it's still a problem, and it's mostly not a federal problem. It's a federal problem, of course. It's mostly not brought on by the Biden administration. They really have done this pretty well. We just weren't prepared with local communities and local states, especially in those states where they didn't want to accept the Affordable Care Act and the Medicaid expansion. So we've seen some resistance, but most of it is inertia. Most of it is just not having the structure in place and on so much of this distribution of money. One of the things that excites me that Janet mentioned, that Diane mentioned, sorry, I was thinking Janet Yellen, that Diane mentioned, is the transformative investment, the $300 billion plus that's slated to go to public housing, to go to vouchers, both project-based and tenant-based, to the trust fund, to down payer assistance, many of these programs. One of the things exciting about it really is transformative in housing infrastructure. It means because when the sort of traditional definition of infrastructure in the Republican initial foray into this is water, sewer, highways, bridges. But we look at a more expansive, and Democrats have looked for a more expansive definition of infrastructure based on the fact, to me, infrastructure is building a foundation for success for families and communities. And if you build a foundation for success for families and communities, you deal with housing, you expand the child tax credit, you look at transit and what you can do there. You look at replacing lead pipes leading into homes, all of those kinds of things. So we need to build more homes people can afford. We need to improve the housing we already have, and we need to make it affordable. That's what the Build Back Better bill is doing. Working closely with Schumer, working, as Diane suggested, with Maxine Waters, and we have worked together long enough over the years that we pretty much, our district's very different from my state overall, but we look at housing in much the same way. the new investments in housing choice vouchers for the lowest income families, people experiencing homelessness, building and rebuilding public housing. I mentioned that earlier, preserving and creating new affordable housing for the lowest income individuals through the Housing Trust Fund. We're working on investments to remove lead paint, to invest in neighborhoods, and make sure that investment doesn't push out residents, to ensure that fair housing laws are actually enforced, to go into areas that have been redlined, although understanding in places like Ohio City and Cleveland and many communities have these sort of partially gentrified areas that were once redlined, and we want to encourage people to buy in those communities. We aim at both first-time home buyers and first-generation home buyers. We don't want a bunch of people like my kids were living in Columbus, not Cleveland. We don't want a bunch of people like my kids whose both parents and grandparents owned homes. That's not who we're aiming at in these formerly redlined communities. We're aiming at people who've not ever owned a home, first-time home buyers, and that their families haven't. So we've learned all that through this process, and you know the stories. And I think that the best thing you can do as you advocate is some of you have been through this. You can tell your own stories. Many of you can. Many of you know, all of you know people who have stories about people who lost their job because of the pandemic, or because of facing eviction, or because, as in Cleveland, our high rate of foreclosure was year after year of industrial job loss, or just people that don't make enough money to afford housing. I mean, you know what's happened in the last 30 years. Income, the profits have generally gone up for corporate America. Stock market's gone up. The executive compensation has skyrocketed, yet wages have remained flat. And you know what that means for the quality of housing in this country. So you also probably know people who had an investor buy their apartment building or buy their trailer park, their manufactured housing area, and raise their rents and evict anyone who can't pay. You know those stories. Tell those stories to members of Congress and to others. One of my favorite Abraham Lincoln quotes. Lincoln was asked. His staff wanted him to stay in the White House and win the war and free the slaves and preserve the Union. He said, "No, I got to go out and get my public opinion baths." Well, senators and congressmen and women don't get enough public opinion baths, so it's important you come to them with your stories and explaining to them why this housing investment is so important. I'll close with this. Dr. King, and one of my favorite writings of Dr. King was the letter from the Birmingham jail. I think you know the story. In 1963, he was jailed, and the white ministers in town, the moderate white ministers that all supported civil rights, said, "Dr. King, slow down a little bit. We're for you. We want voting rights. We want to move forward on this. We're all in, but you got to move a little more slowly." And Dr. King obviously was impatient, and he in the middle of this wonderful letter from the Birmingham jail, he said, "Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability," and it rolls in because of you on this call. Progress here. I mean, this is an opportunity that this will be the biggest year of my long political life if we do what I think we can do. We got the child tax credit and rental assistance in the Relief Act. We got fixed pensions for 100,000 union families in my state, and hundreds of thousands around the country. And now we're going to do this investment in housing and transit, in broadband in low income areas, and it's going to make a huge difference. And progressives, we don't win often. We lose more often than we win, but when we win big, and we win and make transformational, generational change. And that's what this all is all about. It's progress rolling in because of activists like you, and making your voices heard, and making the demands that you should make of people like me to change this country. So thanks for dedicating so much of your life to doing this. Special thanks again to Diane, and look forward to continue to work with you, and look forward, I hope, next year in person. Thanks so much.
Chairman Brown, thank you so much. What incredible words to end our call on. And thank you for your commitment, your leadership, and your championing these transformational investments. I couldn't agree more that this is an extraordinary moment, and we are behind you all the way. Thank you so much, Chairman Brown.
Thank you so much, Diane. Good to see you, and see you next time. Thanks, folks.
Okay, good to see you too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
So no better words to end on, I think, than Chairman Brown's. So just a reminder to keep calling your members of Congress. This moment couldn't be more urgent, more important, to sign your organizations on to our national letter and to look for calls to action from us throughout the week. We'll keep you posted on what's happening and what more you can do. Thank you all for your incredible work and thanks for joining today. Take care. Bye.